The cantina on Nexus 7 was like every other bar on the Outer Rim stations, dark, smoky, and filled with beings trying to forget their problems. Empty bottles lined the walls and the air smelled of cheap alcohol and regret. In the far corner, away from the noise and laughter, sat a figure that made even the toughest smugglers look away. Zarthek was old by Vorthon standards. His once proud carapace was now covered in acid scars that told stories of battles fought long ago. 3 of his 6 limbs had been replaced with crude cybernetic parts that clicked and whirred when he moved. His compound eyes, once a brilliant blue, were now clouded and tired. The veteran had been coming to this same bar for 20 years, always sitting alone, always drinking the same bitter Vorthon spirit. Most patrons knew better than to bother him. They had heard the whispered stories about the old warrior who had fought in the Terran conflicts 50 years ago. But tonight was different. A group of young military officers from various coalition species had gathered near the bar, their voices growing louder with each drink. The humans were lucky, said Krell, a young Krillian officer with bright red scales and an ego twice his size. If the war had continued, we would have crushed them completely. They were just primitives with outdated technology. His companions nodded in agreement. They were all young, born after the wars ended. To them, the Terran conflicts were just history lessons, distant events that happened before they were hatched or born. They wore their coalition uniforms with pride, believing themselves to be part of the greatest military force in the galaxy. My grandfather told me the humans used chemical rockets, laughed Vex, a Quillian whose blue skin shimmered in the dim light. Chemical rockets, while we had antimatter drives. How could such primitives even threaten the coalition? They got lucky with a few ambushes, Krell continued, his voice growing more confident. But if we went to war with them now, with our current technology, it would be over in weeks, maybe days. The clicking sound started low, barely audible over the cantina's background noise. But as the young officers continued their boasting, the clicking grew louder and more insistent. It was the sound of Zarthek's cybernetic claws tapping against his glass, a nervous habit he had developed since the war. The coalition should have finished what we started, Krell declared. Standing up and swaying slightly from the alcohol, we should go to their little system and show them what real military power looks like. The clicking stopped. The sudden silence was more frightening than any roar. Conversations around the cantina died as patrons noticed the change. Zarthek slowly turned his massive head toward the group of young officers. His clouded eyes fixed on Krell with an intensity that made the Krillian scales pale. You think humans are primitives? Zarthek's voice was like grinding metal, rough from years of screaming orders over the noise of battle. You think they were lucky? Krell tried to maintain his confidence, but something in the old veteran's voice made his throat tight. Well, yes. Everyone knows the humans were technologically inferior. They barely had fusion drives while we possessed antimatter technology. Zarthek stood up slowly, his cybernetic limbs groaning under his weight. He was massive, even by Vorthon standards, and the scars covering his body told of countless battles. The entire cantina fell silent as he approached the group of officers. Sit down, younglings, he said quietly, but his voice carried absolute authority. All of you, sit down and listen carefully. The officers found themselves obeying without thinking. Something about the old warrior commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Even Krell, for all his bravado, sank back into his chair. Zarthek gestured to the bartender, who quickly brought over a bottle of the strongest Vorthon spirit available. The veteran poured himself a large glass and drank it in one gulp, before looking at each of the young officers in turn. 50 years ago, I was Fleet Commander Zarthek of the 47th Expansion Force, he began, his voice taking on the tone of someone remembering a nightmare. I commanded 17 dreadnoughts and over 200 smaller vessels. I had conquered 12 star systems and brought 14 species into the coalition, either through diplomacy or force. He poured another drink but didn't touch it yet. We were proud, arrogant. We had been expanding for 3 centuries and no species had ever successfully resisted us for more than a few months. The galaxy was ours for the taking. Vex shifted uncomfortably, but the humans were different. Different? Zarthek's laugh was bitter and harsh. Child, humans weren't just different. They were our worst nightmare made real. We just didn't know it yet. He took a sip of his drink, savoring the burn. When we first detected human transmissions, our xenobiologists were excited. Here was a young species barely out of their home system. They had primitive fusion drives, basic energy weapons, and ships that looked like they were held together with metal patches and hope. That sounds primitive to me, Krell muttered, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. That's what we thought too, Zarthek continued. Our intelligence suggested they had only been in space for a few decades. Their ships were crude compared to ours. Their weapons were simple. Their tactics seemed straightforward. High Command classified them as a Class 3 threat, barely worth a full fleet. He gestured to his scarred body. I got these scars from those primitive humans. I lost 3 limbs fighting those technologically inferior beings. And I was one of the lucky ones who survived. The young officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the story they had been told in the academies. But how? Vex asked quietly. If they were so primitive, how did they hurt the Coalition so badly? Zarthek's compound eyes seemed to focus on something far away, something only he could see, because we made the same mistake you just made. We underestimated them. We thought technology and firepower were all that mattered in war. We forgot that the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the biggest guns, but the one with nothing left to lose. He finished his second drink and poured a third. Let me tell you about my first encounter with humans, younglings. Let me tell you about the day we learned that there are fates worse than death, and that humans had prepared themselves for all of them. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the bartender had stopped cleaning glasses to listen. Stories of the Terran conflicts were rare, and those who had lived through them rarely spoke of their experiences. We intercepted their ships near Proxima Centauri, Zarthek continued. 3 small vessels obviously damaged from some previous engagement. Their hulls were patched with different metals. Their engines were smoking and their formation was scattered. It looked like they were running from something. He paused, his claws clicking against the table. We were right. They were running from something. They were running from us, leading us exactly where they wanted us to go. Krell leaned forward despite himself. What do you mean? I mean, youngling, that from the moment we detected those ships we were already trapped. We just didn't know it yet. Zarthek's voice dropped to almost a whisper. The humans had been watching us for months, studying our tactics, learning our weaknesses. Those 3 damaged ships weren't refugees or scouts. He looked directly at each officer, his clouded eyes somehow seeing right through them. They were bait. Zarthek poured another drink, his cybernetic hand steady despite the memories flooding back. The young officers sat in complete silence, hanging on every word. The old veteran's eyes seemed to glow in the dim cantina light as he continued his tale. Our ships approached the 3 human vessels with standard protocols, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 50 years of regret. We powered up our weapons, activated our shields, and transmitted the usual surrender demands. The humans responded immediately, which surprised us. Most species try to run or fight before they talk. He took a small sip, letting the alcohol burn away some of the pain of remembering. Their lead ship transmitted a request for parley. The voice belonged to someone who identified herself as Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force. She sounded tired, frightened, and completely overwhelmed by our presence. Vex shifted in his seat. That seems normal for first contact with the Coalition. Normal, yes, Zarthek agreed. Which is exactly what they wanted us to think. Admiral Chen requested permission to come aboard my flagship for negotiations. She claimed she had authority to speak for all human colonies and that she wanted to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The veteran's mandibles clicked softly as he remembered. I granted her request, of course. It was standard procedure. Most species prefer to surrender with dignity rather than be conquered by force. It saves lives on both sides and makes integration into the Coalition smoother. He gestured with one of his cybernetic arms, the servos whining softly. Chen arrived in a small shuttle that looked like it might fall apart at any moment. The hull was patched with at least 6 different types of metal, and I could see jury-rigged repairs all along its surface. When she stepped out, I was struck by how small humans are compared to most spacefaring species. Krell couldn't help but interrupt. Small and primitive, just as we always heard. Small, yes, Zarthek said firmly, but not primitive, though it took me years to understand the difference. He closed his eyes, remembering every detail of that first meeting. Admiral Chen was exactly what we expected to see. A tired military officer from a backwater species, overwhelmed by contact with the superior galactic civilization. She wore a simple uniform that looked mass-produced and carried herself with the nervous energy of someone out of their depth. The veteran opened his eyes and stared directly at the young officers. She was the finest actress I have ever encountered. Actress? Vex asked, confused. Every gesture, every word, every nervous glance was calculated to make us underestimate her, Zarthek explained. She spoke with obvious awe about our technology. She asked questions about our ships that seemed innocent, but revealed nothing about human capabilities. She appeared fascinated by our culture and grateful for our generous offer of coalition membership. He finished his drink and immediately poured another. During the negotiations, Chen readily agreed to surrender the outer human colonies. She begged only that Earth itself be spared, offering to provide raw materials and labor from the colonies to prove human usefulness to the coalition. That sounds like a reasonable surrender, Krail said, though his voice held less certainty than before. It was exactly what we wanted to hear, Zarthek admitted. Chen provided detailed information about human colony locations, defensive capabilities, and resource production. She seemed eager to please, desperate to find a place for her species in the greater galactic community. The veteran's voice grew darker. She even warned us about certain human extremist groups that might resist coalition rule. She gave us intelligence about their likely hideouts and tactics. She seemed genuinely worried that these terrorists might cause trouble for both our species. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Everything she told us was true. Every piece of intelligence was accurate. Every detail about human capabilities was correct. But the truth, younglings, can be the most effective lie of all. Vex leaned forward. What do you mean? Chen told us humans had fusion drives. True. She told us they had basic energy weapons. True. She told us their ships were lightly armored and built for speed rather than heavy combat. Also true. Zarthek's claws clicked against the table in a rapid rhythm. What she didn't tell us was how humans use truth as a weapon. He gestured to the bartender for another bottle. After the negotiations, Chen requested safe passage for her remaining ships to warn the colonies about the new arrangement. She seemed genuinely concerned about preventing panic and resistance among her people. And you let her go? Krell asked. Of course we did, Zarthek replied. It was in our best interest to have human leadership maintain order during the transition. Chen promised to broadcast surrender orders to all human military units and to guide them to designated assembly points for peaceful disarmament. The veteran's laugh was bitter and harsh. We even escorted her ships partway to the Sol system to ensure their safety. We wanted to maintain good relations with our newest coalition members. He took a long drink before continuing. Chen's ships were indeed headed for the Sol system, but not to surrender. They were racing ahead of us to trigger the largest military trap in galactic history. A trap? Vex whispered. For 3 months we followed standard coalition integration procedures, Zarthek explained. We sent survey teams to catalog human colonies. We dispatched administrative units to begin establishing coalition governance. We prepared cultural exchange programs and economic integration plans. His voice grew quiet and dangerous, and all the while the humans were preparing for war. But you said Admiral Chen surrendered, Krell protested. She surrendered the outer colonies, Zarthek corrected. 17 worlds with minimal populations and resources. What she didn't surrender was Earth, Luna, Mars, or any of the major industrial centers of the Sol system. He stood up slowly, his cybernetic limbs groaning. 3 months after first contact, we received reports that human extremist groups were indeed causing problems in the outer colonies. Pirates were attacking coalition survey ships. Saboteurs were destroying communication equipment. Resistance cells were targeting administrative centers. Just as Chen warned you, Vex observed. Exactly as she warned us, Zarthek agreed, which made High Command decide that a show of force was necessary. We needed to demonstrate coalition power to discourage further resistance. He began pacing, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silent cantina. I was ordered to take my fleet to the Sol system and demand the surrender of the extremist groups. It was supposed to be a simple police action. We would arrest the terrorist leaders, make a few examples, and establish permanent coalition authority. That sounds reasonable, Krell said weakly. It was perfectly reasonable. Zarthek stopped pacing and fixed the young Krillian with his clouded gaze, which is exactly why it was the perfect trap. He returned to his seat and poured another drink. When we entered the Sol system, We found exactly what Chen had promised us. Earth was broadcasting surrender signals. Luna had prepared landing facilities for coalition administrators. Mars was transmitting detailed mining reports for our economic surveys. So where was the trap? Vex asked. Zarthek's mandibles spread in what might have been a smile if it hadn't been so terrifying. The trap, youngling, was that everything was exactly as promised. The humans had prepared a perfect surrender, complete with ceremonies, speeches, and formal transfer of authority. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but they had also prepared for us to refuse it. The cantina had grown even quieter, if such a thing was possible. Zarthek's audience was completely absorbed in his story, though they barely understood what they were about to hear. The old veteran took a long drink and continued, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible memories. My fleet entered the Sol system in standard formation, he began, his cybernetic claws tracing patterns on the table, 17 dreadnoughts, 37 heavy cruisers, and over 200 support vessels. It was enough firepower to level a planet or conquer an entire star system. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. We approached Earth along the standard vector, maintaining proper spacing and defensive formations. Our sensors showed exactly what we expected to see. A small number of human vessels near Earth, transmitting surrender codes. Mining operations on several asteroids. Normal civilian traffic between the inner planets. Vex shifted uncomfortably. That sounds normal for a surrendering system. It was perfect, Zarthek agreed. Too perfect. But we didn't realize that yet. The veteran stood and began pacing again, his heavy footsteps marking time like a funeral drum. Admiral Chen contacted us as soon as we entered sensor range. She was aboard a flagship near Earth, and she seemed genuinely relieved to see us. She thanked us for our patience and promised that the transfer of authority would proceed smoothly. But, Krell prompted, though his voice had lost all of its earlier confidence. But she also informed us that the extremist groups we had come to arrest were hiding in the asteroid belt. Zarthek continued. She provided detailed coordinates and warned us that they might try to run when they detected our approach. He stopped pacing and looked directly at each of the young officers. She was giving us permission to pursue them. That seems helpful, Vex said weakly. It was an invitation to our own destruction, Zarthek replied, though we didn't understand that until it was too late. The veteran returned to his seat and poured another drink. His hands, both organic and cybernetic, were shaking slightly. I ordered a third of my fleet to pursue the extremists while the remainder secured the inner system. Standard tactics for dealing with scattered resistance. He took a sip and closed his compound eyes. 73 ships entered the asteroid belt in pursuit of what we thought were fleeing terrorists. They found asteroids, all right, thousands of them drifting in normal orbital patterns around the sun. And? Krell asked, though he seemed afraid to hear the answer. And then the asteroids turned on their engines. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background noise of the cantina seemed to have stopped. The young officers stared at Zarthek in confusion and growing horror. What do you mean, turned on their engines? Vex whispered. I mean exactly that, Zarthek replied, his voice flat and emotionless. What we thought were asteroids were human ships. Hundreds of them powered down and hidden in plain sight. They had been waiting for us for months, maybe years. He opened his eyes and the young officers could see the pain there. The humans had taken real asteroids, hollowed them out, and built warships inside. From the outside, they looked like normal space rocks. Our sensors detected metal and stone, which is exactly what asteroids contain. They were perfectly camouflaged. Krell was leaning forward now, his red scales pale with shock. How many ships? We never got an accurate count, Zarthek admitted. Our estimates ranged from 800 to over 1,000 vessels hidden throughout the system. They weren't just in the asteroid belt. They were everywhere. He gestured weakly with one cybernetic arm. Some were disguised as asteroids. Others were hidden in the rings of the gas giants. A few were even concealed in the shadows of moons, powered down completely to avoid detection. But their technology was primitive. Vex protested. You said so yourself. Their individual ships were less advanced than ours, Zarthek corrected. But their tactics were something we had never encountered. They didn't fight like any species we had ever met. The veteran took another drink, larger this time. When the hidden ships activated, they didn't attack immediately. Instead, they moved to surround our forces. Within minutes, every coalition ship in the system found itself facing enemies from multiple directions. He laughed bitterly. We had walked into the most sophisticated ambush in military history, and we didn't even realize it yet. What happened next? Krell asked, though his voice was barely audible. The human ships opened fire, Zarthek said simply, but not with the primitive weapons we expected. They had been salvaging our technology for months, ever since first contact. Every survey ship we had sent to human colonies, every piece of equipment we had shared during negotiations, every technological exchange we had made in good faith. His mandibles clicked rapidly. The humans had reverse-engineered all of it. Their ships now carried weapons based on our own designs, modified and improved in ways we never would have thought possible. Improved? Vex asked weakly. Humans don't just copy technology, Zarthek explained. They improve it. They find ways to make it more efficient, more deadly, more effective. They took our energy weapons and made them faster firing. They studied our shields and built weapons specifically designed to penetrate them. He stood up again, unable to sit still with the memories flooding back. But the worst part wasn't their technology. It was their tactics. Well, what do you mean? Krell whispered. Coalition military doctrine is based on honor, efficiency, and minimal casualties, Zarthek said. We fight to win quickly and cleanly, with as little destruction as possible. It makes occupation easier and reduces resistance. His voice grew darker. Humans fight to win at any cost. He began pacing again, his footsteps heavy and ominous. Our ships in the asteroid belt found themselves under attack from enemies they couldn't properly target. The human vessels would fire, then immediately move to new positions. They used the asteroids themselves as weapons, accelerating chunks of rock at our ships with railguns. Railguns? Vex asked. Primitive kinetic weapons, Zarthek explained. Except when you fire a 10-ton asteroid at near light speed, primitive becomes devastating. He stopped and turned to face them. But that wasn't the worst part. The young officers waited in terrified silence. The worst part was when the human ships started ramming us. Ramming? Krell's voice cracked. Deliberate collision attacks, Zarthek confirmed. Human ships would accelerate directly at our vessels and detonate their engines just before impact. They turned themselves into guided missiles, sacrificing their own lives to destroy our ships. He sat down heavily, his cybernetic limbs groaning. No species had ever done that before. In 3 centuries of expansion, we had never encountered an enemy willing to die just to kill us. That's insane, Vex breathed. That's human, Zarthek corrected. And it was only the beginning. He poured another drink but didn't touch it. While our forces in the asteroid belt were being destroyed, Admiral, Chen sent us another message from Earth. She apologized for the actions of the extremists and offered to help coordinate a joint operation to eliminate them. Even while her people were attacking you? Krell asked in disbelief. Even while her people were dying to kill us, Zarthek confirmed. She maintained the fiction that these were rogue elements acting against human government orders. She offered to provide intelligence about extremist bases and tactics. His laugh was bitter and terrifying, and we believed her. Even as our ships were being destroyed, we still thought we were dealing with a civil insurrection rather than a coordinated military operation. He finally picked up his drink and drained it in one gulp. It wasn't until my sister ship, the Blade of Conquest, was torn apart by a human vessel that had been built inside a metallic asteroid that I finally understood the truth. What truth? Vex whispered, Zarthek's compound eyes fixed on each of them in turn. That we weren't fighting extremists or terrorists or rogue elements. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We were fighting the entire human species, and they had been preparing for this war since the day they detected our first transmissions. Zarthek reached for the bottle with a shaking cybernetic hand. The young officers watched in fascination and horror as the old veteran struggled with memories that had haunted him for 50 years. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of unspeakable experiences. What was supposed to be a simple police action became the longest and most brutal conflict in Coalition history, he began, staring into his glass as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. 5 years, 3 months, and 16 days of warfare that changed everything we thought we knew about combat. He took a small sip and continued. After the ambush in the Sol system, High Command ordered a full military response. They couldn't allow a primitive species to humiliate the Coalition. More fleets were dispatched, better equipped and with strict orders to crush human resistance completely. Vex shifted uncomfortably. Surely your superior numbers and technology gave you an advantage. Numbers and technology, Zarthek repeated slowly. Yes, we had both. But humans had something we didn't understand at the time. They had spent their entire history fighting each other, and they were very, very good at it. He gestured with one organic arm, the movement stiff from old injuries. Coalition warfare is civilized. We have rules, protocols, and accepted practices. We fight to achieve political objectives with minimal casualties. We avoid targeting civilian populations. We preserve infrastructure for post-war reconstruction. His mandibles clicked in what might have been bitter laughter. Humans threw away the rulebook on the first day. What do you mean? Krell asked, though his voice was barely audible. I mean, they fought total war from the very beginning, Zarthek explained. Every human was a potential combatant. Every civilian transport could be carrying weapons. Every colony could be a military base in disguise. He stood up and began pacing again, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silent cantina. We would occupy a human world, establish administration, and begin integration procedures. Everything would seem normal for weeks or even months. Then the attacks would begin. Guerrilla warfare? Vex suggested. Beyond guerrilla warfare, Zarthek corrected. Humans didn't just attack our military forces. They attacked our supply lines, our communication networks, our administrative centers. They made it impossible for us to maintain control of any territory. He stopped pacing and turned to face them. But the worst part was that they seemed to enjoy it. The young officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the sanitized version of history they had learned in their academies. Human prisoners would sing while being interrogated. Zarthek continued, his voice growing darker. They would laugh when we threatened them with death. Some would actually volunteer information about fake military installations, sending our forces into elaborate traps. He returned to his seat and poured another drink. They painted their ships with the names of coalition vessels they had destroyed. They broadcast the screams of captured coalition soldiers over open channels. They turned psychological warfare into an art form. That's disturbing, Vex said weakly. Disturbing was when they started the retribution fleets, Zarthek replied. 3 years into the war, humans began launching deep strike missions into coalition territory. Not to capture worlds or establish bases, but simply to cause as much damage as possible before being destroyed. He took a long drink before continuing. These weren't military objectives in any traditional sense. Human fleets would emerge from hyperspace, attack civilian installations, destroy infrastructure, and then fight to the death when coalition forces responded. Krell was leaning forward now, his earlier bravado completely forgotten. They were attacking civilians? They were attacking everything, Zarthek confirmed. Military bases, civilian colonies, trade routes, communication relays. Nothing was off limits. They seemed determined to make the entire galaxy pay for our conflict with them. He gestured weakly. Coalition worlds that had never seen warfare suddenly found themselves under attack by humans who had traveled hundreds of light years just to die killing us. That makes no strategic sense. Vex protested. It made perfect strategic sense, Zarthek corrected. They were forcing us to spread our forces across thousands of worlds instead of concentrating them against Earth. Every coalition planet now needed protection. Every trade route required escorts. Every communication relay demanded guards. His cybernetic hand clenched into a fist. Humans turned our own empire against us. The larger our territory, the more vulnerable we became. He stood up again, unable to remain still. But the retribution fleets weren't the worst part. The worst part was what they did to themselves. To themselves? Krell whispered. Human colonies under coalition occupation would resist until the very end, Zarthek explained. When defeat became inevitable, they would destroy everything of value rather than let us have it. His voice grew quiet and haunted. I watched an entire human colony detonate their fusion reactor rather than surrender. 50,000 civilians dead in an instant, just to deny us their industrial facilities. He began pacing again, faster this time. They would poison their own water supplies, destroy their own food production, sabotage their own infrastructure. They preferred to die free than live under coalition rule. That's madness, Vex breathed. That's dedication, Zarthek corrected. And it was effective. Every human world we captured became worthless. Every victory cost us more than defeat would have. He stopped and fixed them with his clouded gaze. 4 years into the war, coalition forces had occupied 17 human colonies and destroyed their industrial capacity. But the war was costing us more ships, more resources, and more lives than we could afford. What about Earth itself? Krell asked. Earth remained untouchable, Zarthek replied. Every time we tried to approach the Sol system, we faced the same coordinated defense that had destroyed my first fleet. Hidden ships, kamikaze attacks, and weapons that seemed to improve with every engagement. He sat down heavily. Humans were learning from every battle. They would analyze our tactics, study our technology, and develop countermeasures faster than we could deploy new strategies. How is that possible? Vex asked. Because they shared information instantly across their entire species, Zarthek explained. Every human ship was connected to every other human ship. What one learned, they all learned. When we developed a new weapon, every human commander knew about it within days. He poured another drink, his hands shaking worse than before. By the 5th year, we weren't fighting the same enemy we had encountered at first contact. Human ships were now equipped with technology equal to our own, tactics superior to ours, and a level of determination that defied all logic. But surely the Coalition could have won eventually, Krell suggested weakly. Zarthek's laugh was harsh and bitter. Win? Youngling, by the 5th year, we were losing ships faster than we could build them. Human attacks had reached the core worlds. Coalition member species were beginning to question whether the war was worth the cost. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. And then Coalition intelligence discovered the humans' final contingency plan. The young officers waited in terrified silence. Automated revenge fleets, Zarthek said simply. Thousands of ships built in secret facilities throughout human space programmed to launch if Earth was ever destroyed. Revenge fleets? Vex asked weakly. Ships designed to hunt down every Coalition world and destroy them, Zarthek confirmed. Not to conquer, not to occupy, just to kill. If we destroyed humanity, these automated fleets would continue their mission for centuries, ensuring that the Coalition died with them. He finished his drink and stared at the empty glass. That's when High Command finally understood the truth about humans. What truth? Krell whispered. Zarthek looked up, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's dim lights, that they would rather see the galaxy burn than accept defeat. The cantina had been silent for so long that the ambient sounds of the space station seemed unusually loud. Zarthek sat motionless for several minutes, staring at his empty glass as if it contained the answers to questions that had haunted him for half a century. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The armistice negotiations began in the 6th year of the war, he said, each word carefully chosen. But it wasn't the Coalition that requested them. Vex looked confused. If you were winning, why would you negotiate? We weren't winning, Zarthek replied simply. We were dying. The Coalition was hemorrhaging ships, resources, and entire member species. 3 worlds had already voted to leave rather than continue supporting a war they saw as unwinnable. He poured the last of the bottle into his glass. High Command realized that even if we somehow managed to destroy humanity, there wouldn't be enough Coalition forces left to maintain our empire. We would win the war and lose everything else. Krell shifted uncomfortably. But the histories say the Coalition achieved victory. The histories lie, Zarthek said flatly. Or at best, they tell a very selective version of the truth. He took a small sip and continued. The armistice was proposed by Admiral Chen, the same human who had deceived us at first contact. She contacted Coalition High Command directly, bypassing all military channels. What did she offer? Vex asked. A return to the original surrender terms, Zarthek replied. Humans would withdraw to the Sol system and remain there for 50 years. They would cease all attacks on Coalition territory and abandon their occupied colonies. In exchange, the Coalition would provide certain technological exchanges and agree to leave human space alone. He gestured with one cybernetic arm. It was essentially the same deal she had offered 6 years earlier, except now it was the Coalition that was desperate to accept. That sounds like human surrender, Krell said, though his voice lacked conviction. It was human mercy, Zarthek corrected. They could have continued the war until we were all dead. Instead, they offered us a way to save face while ending the conflict. The veteran stood up slowly, his cybernetic limbs groaning under his weight. The negotiations took place on a neutral station in the border region. I was there as a military advisor, along with representatives from 12 Coalition species. He began pacing again, but slower this time, as if each step carried enormous weight. Admiral Chen arrived with a small delegation. She looked exactly the same as she had 6 years earlier, except for her eyes. They held a hardness that hadn't been there during first contact. What were the actual terms? Vex asked. Publicly, the armistice established a 50-year buffer period during which humans would remain in their home system while the coalition consolidated its territorial gains, Zarthek explained. Privately, it was an agreement of mutual non-aggression disguised as human capitulation. He stopped pacing and faced the young officers. The coalition agreed to never again approach human space. Humans agreed to limit their expansion for 50 years. Both sides would share certain technologies and maintain minimal diplomatic contact. That doesn't sound so bad, Krell said weakly. The public terms weren't the real agreement, Zarthek replied. The real agreement was what Chen called the insurance policy. He sat down heavily and stared at his glass. Those automated revenge fleets I mentioned? They weren't just a contingency plan for if Earth was destroyed. They were a permanent deterrent ready to launch if the coalition ever broke the armistice. Permanent, Vex whispered. For 1,000 years, Zarthek confirmed. If any coalition force entered human space without permission, if any coalition member attacked human interests, if humanity ever faced extinction from any source, those ships would activate automatically. His voice grew darker, and they wouldn't just target the aggressor. They would hunt down every coalition world, every member species, every civilian population. Total extinction, guaranteed and unavoidable. The young officers sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they were hearing. But that was 50 years ago. Krell finally managed. The treaty must have expired by now. The 50-year restriction on human expansion expired 10 years ago, Zarthek confirmed. But the insurance policy remains in effect. He leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting decades of fear and respect. Do you want to know the real reason the coalition has never tried to contact humanity since the armistice? The young officers nodded wordlessly. Because we're terrified of what they've become, Zarthek said simply. 50 years of technological development, 50 years of military preparation, 50 years of planning for our next meeting. He gestured toward the viewport, where stars glittered in the darkness of space. Somewhere out there, around a small yellow star, lives a species that once turned asteroids into warships and fought the entire galaxy to a standstill using primitive technology. And now? Vex asked, though she seemed afraid to hear the answer. Now they've had 50 years to improve, Zarthek replied. 50 years to develop new weapons, new tactics, new ways to kill anyone who threatens them. He stood up one final time, preparing to leave. Coalition intelligence estimates that human technology has advanced at least a century beyond our current capabilities. Their population has grown from billions to possibly trillions. Their industrial capacity may exceed the entire coalition combined. Krell was pale, his red scales having faded to a sickly pink. What about their ships? Their military forces? Unknown, Zarthek admitted. No coalition vessel has entered the Sol system since the armistice. No human ship has been detected outside their borders. We know nothing about their current capabilities. He moved toward the cantina's exit, his cybernetic limbs clicking against the floor. But we do know one thing for certain. What? Vex whispered. They're still there, Zarthek said, pausing at the door. Still watching. Still waiting. Still prepared to defend themselves against anyone who might threaten them. He turned back to face the young officers one last time. 3 years ago, the coalition received a diplomatic message from Earth. It was addressed to High Command and contained only 7 words. The cantina was completely silent, every patron straining to hear. The message said, "We remember everything. Leave us alone." Zarthek's mandibles clicked one final time. That message wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was a warning. He opened the door to leave but paused. You asked earlier why the coalition has never returned to human space. You wanted to know why we don't conquer them now while we have the chance? Yes, Krell said weakly. Because there is no chance, Zarthek replied. There never was. Humans didn't join the coalition because they couldn't defeat us. They didn't join because they chose not to. He stepped through the doorway but turned back one last time. They let us think we were the predators when they were really the prey. They showed us exactly enough strength to make us cautious, but not enough to make us afraid. Until it was too late, Vex added quietly. Until we learned that some species are too dangerous to fight and too proud to submit, Zarthek confirmed. The Coalition rules the galaxy, younglings. All of it except for one small system around a yellow star. He began to walk away but called back over his shoulder. And if we're wise, if we want to keep ruling the rest of the galaxy, we'll make sure it stays that way. The door closed behind him, leaving the young officers alone with their thoughts and the terrible knowledge that somewhere in the darkness between the stars, humanity was waiting. Outside the cantina's viewport, the stars continued their eternal dance, cold and beautiful, and utterly indifferent to the fears of the species that traveled between them. But among those countless points of light, one small yellow star burned quietly, home to a species that had once fought the galaxy itself and won by refusing to lose. The Coalition had learned to rule through strength and fear, but they had also learned that some victories come at too high a price, and some enemies are better left alone. In the silence that followed Zarthek's departure, the young officers began to understand why their elders spoke of humans only in whispers, and why the greatest military force in galactic history had chosen peace over the alternative.